At 7 o'clock in the morning, the plumber called me and said there was something sealed inside my walls and the police were already in my house. He said it like he was reporting the weather. Flat. Careful. Like if he said it too fast, it might become something worse. I remember looking at the clock on my nightstand. 7:02. The second hand ticking like nothing unusual had just happened. Of all the things I expected to hear that morning, that was not on the list. If you have ever gotten a call that makes your stomach drop before your mind catches up, you already know the feeling. Stay with me for a minute, because what they found inside those walls was not the beginning of the story. It was the part they thought would finish me. I sat there with the phone still pressed to my ear, like an idiot trying to decide if I had misheard him. "What do you mean sealed?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear something in the background. Boots on hardwood. A radio crackling. "Ma'am," he said, voice lower now, "there's cash in here. Equipment too. And they say your name is on some of it. My name." That part landed first. Not the police, not the walls, my name. I didn't ask how, I didn't ask why. Because somewhere underneath the shock, something colder had already started forming. This wasn't random. I swung my legs off the bed. The floor was cold. I noticed that. Funny what the brain decides to hold on to. "I'll be there," I said. I ended the call and just sat there for a second longer to calm us. No shaking hands. No panic. That surprised me. 3 days earlier, my sister had taken $3.9 million that should have been split between us and handed me a condemned house like it was a consolation prize. She'd looked me straight in the eye when she did it, smiled even. "This is more than you deserve." I almost laughed then. Not from joy, from the sheer precision of it. And now, apparently, the house came with police. I stood up and pulled on the first clothes I could find. Jeans, an old sweater, the one with a loose thread at the cuff I kept meaning to fix. I grabbed my keys, my phone, my bag. The leather strap creaked when I lifted it, same sound it had made for years. Nothing about that morning felt dramatic. That was the strange part. No music swelling, no sudden clarity, just small, ordinary movements. I brushed my teeth, I tied my hair back. I checked the door twice before I left, like I was heading to work. The drive took 23 minutes. I watched the clock the whole time because watching the clock meant I didn't have to think yet. I remember only one thing about that road. The closer I got, the clearer it became. Not softer, clearer. By the time I turned onto the street, I could see them. 2 patrol cars parked out front. Lights off, but present. That quiet kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself. There was yellow tape across the walkway leading to the front door. For a second, I just sat in the car with the engine running. This was my house. At least, legally, it was. The house my grandmother had left me. The house my sister had been very, very eager for me to take. I turned the engine off and stepped out. Cold air hit my face. It smelled faintly like damp wood and something metallic I couldn't place. One of the officers noticed me right away. "Ma'am, you can't cross the tape. That's my house," I said. He looked at me for a moment, not hostile, just measuring. "Name, Cynthia." He nodded toward the other officer. They exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. "Go ahead, but stay with us." I ducked under the tape. The front door was open. The frame slightly warped, like it had been forced too many times, or maybe just neglected for too long. Inside, the house felt colder than outside. Not temperature, something else. Harold stood in the hallway, near the living room. He looked smaller than I remembered from yesterday, or maybe just more uncertain. When he saw me, he exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for a while. "Miss Cynthia, I didn't know this was going to turn into all this." "What did you find?" I asked. He gestured toward the living room. They opened it up. I walked past him. The wall had been cut clean through. A rectangle carved out like someone had drawn it there years ago, waiting. Inside, there was a cavity, larger than it should have been. And inside that space were stacks of cash, rubber banded, neat, not scattered, not hidden in panic, organized. Next to it, small black devices, wires, something that looked like recording equipment. For a second, I just stood there. I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt recognition, not of the objects themselves, but of the intent behind them. This was built. One of the officers stepped closer. "Are you aware of any of this?" "No," I said. That was true, and not true in the way they were thinking. He crouched down, picking up a folder that had been tucked along the side. He flipped it open. My name is on these documents. He didn't phrase it as a question. I stepped closer, just enough to see Cynthia Pierce. Printed clean, official looking. I stared at it. I had never seen those papers before in my life, but there it was. My name, my address, this address, my house. I let out a slow breath. Of course it was. Of course they had made sure of that. The officer stood up. Ma'am, we're going to need you to answer a few questions. I nodded. I always nod first. It's a habit. A leftover from a version of myself that thought compliance kept things from getting worse. He led me into the kitchen. One of the chairs had been pulled out already. I sat. My hands rested on the table, still steady. You said you just took possession of this property. Yes? When? 3 days ago. From who? My grandmother passed. It was part of the estate. And the cash. I looked at him. I've never seen that before. He held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary. People say that a lot. I almost smiled. I'm sure they do. He wrote something down. You live here? No. Then why the renovation? Because I wasn't going to sell it. That made him pause. Why not? Good question. I leaned back slightly in the chair. Because everyone expected me to. That was the simplest version of the truth. What I didn't say was that my sister had pushed too hard, too fast. Like she needed me to get rid of this place before I had time to think. Like this house was a problem she needed handled. And she had decided I would be the one to handle it. The officer tapped his pen lightly against the notepad. Who else has access to the property? I thought about that. My sister had been here before the transfer, multiple times. So had my dad. My mom never came. She didn't like places that felt unfinished. She used to say they made her anxious. I could still hear her voice saying that, soft and dismissive at the same time. No one recently, I said. That wasn't entirely true either, but I wasn't ready to say their names out loud in this room. Not yet. The officer nodded again, like he had expected that answer. We're going to secure the site and process everything here. Until we understand what we're dealing with, you'll need to remain available for further questions. Available. I looked past him, back toward the living room. Toward the open wall. Toward the space that had been hidden there long before I ever stepped foot in this house. They had planned this, not in a rushed, careless way, in a slow, deliberate one, layer by layer. A story built over years, maybe longer. A story where I was always going to be the ending. I felt something shift inside me then, not panic, not anger. Something quieter than both. They thought this would finish me. They thought I would unravel right there in that kitchen, fall apart exactly the way they had taught everyone to expect. I looked back at the officer. I understand, I said, and I did. Just not in the way he meant. He asked another question. I answered it. My hands stayed on the table. Still. And underneath everything. Underneath the documents and the cash and my name on things I had never signed. One question kept forming, slow and cold. How long had they been building this? I didn't have the answer yet, but I was going to find it. 3 days earlier, I had been sitting in a quiet office in Charlotte, North Carolina, watching a woman I barely knew explain how my life had just been divided into something measurable. At the time, I didn't know yet what I was watching. I thought it was just a will reading. I thought the worst thing in that room was the number. It was a Thursday afternoon, a little after 2. I remember the light coming through the window, thin and gray, the kind that makes everything feel flatter than it really is. The office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building near Dilworth. Law firms, financial advisors, places where people sit down and put numbers on things that don't feel like numbers. Sandra Langley. Langley sat across from us, hands folded neatly over a stack of documents. She had that calm, practiced tone people develop after years of telling families things they don't want to hear. I had met her once before, years ago, when my grandma first updated her estate. Back then, she had looked at me differently, not warmly, just directly. That day, she barely looked at me at all. Victoria sat to my left, perfectly still, like she had rehearsed the moment. Her blazer was pressed, her hair pulled back tight, not a strand out of place. I noticed that. I always notice details like that. My dad sat next to her, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped together. He looked at the table more than he looked at anyone else. My mom sat on the other side of me, close enough that I could feel her elbow brush mine every so often. A quiet reminder. Stay still. Don't say the wrong thing. Sandra Langley cleared her throat. We will begin with the distribution of assets as outlined in the most recent revision of the estate. Her voice was steady, measured, like she was reading a weather report. She started with the easy parts. Liquid assets, investment accounts, property holdings. Numbers I had heard before, but never like this. $3.9 million. That was the total value allocated across accounts and real estate. Victoria didn't react when the number was said out loud, not even a flicker. I felt something shift in my chest. Not excitement, not hope, just awareness. That number meant something, just not to me in the way it should have. Sandra Langley continued. Control of the primary trust will be assigned to Victoria Pierce with full authority over distribution and management. There it was. Clean. Simple. I glanced at Victoria. She didn't look at me. She didn't need to. She already knew. My dad shifted slightly in his chair, a small movement like he had adjusted his weight and nothing more. My mom reached over and placed her hand on mine. Light pressure. Reassuring if you didn't know better. This is what your grandma wanted, she said softly. I didn't pull my hand away. I didn't ask the question that sat right at the edge of my throat. Instead, I waited. Sandra Langley flipped to the next page. For Cynthia Pierce, the estate includes the property located at 127 Hollow Creek Road. That was it. No numbers, no accounts, no additional explanation, just the address. The room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. I knew that address. I had been there once, maybe twice, when I was younger. The house had always felt unfinished, like something about it had been paused and never resumed. Condemned, Victoria said lightly, as if clarifying a minor detail. It needs work. Her tone was almost kind. That made it worse. I looked at Sandra Langley. Is that all? She hesitated, just a fraction of a second. Yes. Something in that pause stayed with me. Not long enough for anyone else to notice. Long enough for me. My mom squeezed my hand again. It's still a house, honey. You can fix it up, make it your own. Honey. She only called me when she was trying to smooth something over. I nodded. I always nod. Victoria finally turned toward me then. She tilted her head slightly, studying my face like she was looking for something. A reaction. A crack. You should be grateful, she said. A lot of people would be happy to get anything. There it was. The line she had been holding back. You don't deserve more than this. She said it calmly, not loud, not angry. Like a fact. I almost laughed. Not out loud. Just inside, where it didn't show. Of all the ways she could have said it, she chose the one that sounded the most reasonable. That was her talent. Turning something cruel into something that sounded like logic. And the worst part was, I think she believed it. Not out of cruelty. Out of a math she had been running for years. She had done more, stayed closer, managed everything my parents couldn't. In her version, she had earned this. And I was the variable that didn't fit the equation. The one who kept existing without contributing. That was how she had always seen me. Not as a threat, as an inefficiency. Something to be managed around. My dad shifted again. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. He didn't say anything. He rarely did when it mattered. Sandra Langley began gathering the papers, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. If there are no further questions, we can proceed with the transfer documentation. I should have asked more. I should have pushed, but I didn't. Not because I agreed, because I recognized the pattern. Every time I had pushed in the past, the outcome had been the same. Cynthia is overreacting. Cynthia is emotional. Cynthia is unstable. That word had followed me for years. It showed up in quiet conversations, in concerned looks, in the way decisions were made around me instead of with me. I had learned to step back before they could use it again. I'll take the house, I said. Sandra Langley looked up at me then. Really looked, for the first time since we started. Are you sure? Another pause. Small, controlled, but there. Yes. Victoria leaned back slightly, a faint smile touching the corner of her mouth. That's probably for the best. Of course it was. For her. We signed the documents, page after page. Initial here. Sign here. My name was written over and over again in clean, deliberate strokes. Cynthia Pierce. I wondered, briefly, how many times my name had been written on things I had never seen. The thought came and went. When it was done, Sandra Langley handed me a folder. This contains the transfer paperwork and property details. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the folder for a second before she let go. If you have any questions, you can contact my office. Her tone was the same, professional, neutral, but there was something underneath it, something she wasn't saying. Victoria stood, smoothing her jacket. "We'll let you handle everything from here," she said. "We." I nodded again. "Of course." We walked out together. The hallway smelled faintly like coffee and paper. A copier running somewhere in the distance. Normal sounds. Normal place. My mom slipped her arm through mine as we walked toward the elevator. "You're going to be fine," she said softly. "This could be a good opportunity for you." Opportunity. I pressed the elevator button. The doors opened with a quiet chime. We stepped inside. No one spoke on the way down. Victoria checked her phone. My dad stared at the floor. My mom kept her hand on my arm. I watched the numbers change above the door. 3, 2, 1. When the doors opened, Victoria stepped out first. "Call me if you need help," she said over her shoulder. I knew what that meant. Help that came with conditions. Help that came with reminders. I stepped out into the parking lot. The air was warmer than I expected. Late afternoon sun hitting the asphalt, reflecting back in waves. I stood there for a moment, the folder still in my hand. A condemned house. That was what I had been given. That was what they thought I would do with it. Sell it quickly. Cheap. Move on. Disappear. In a way that looked like a choice. I opened the folder. Property details. Inspection notes. Violations listed in clean typed lines, structural issues, electrical problems, water damage, enough to scare most people off. Enough to justify a low offer. I closed the folder. Something about it felt too neat, too ready. Like the story had already been written and all I had to do was follow it. I looked back at the building behind me. 3rd floor. That window. Sandra Langley was probably still up there. I wondered if she had said everything she was supposed to say, or if she had left something out. The thought lingered longer this time. Then I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel, the folder resting on the passenger seat. I could still hear Victoria's voice. "You don't deserve more than this." Maybe she believed that. Maybe they all did. Or maybe they needed me to believe it. I started the engine. The car hummed to life, steady and familiar. I put it in drive. I didn't go home. Instead, I turned onto Hollow Creek Road. I wanted to see it again. Not from memory. Not from a line on a page. In person. The house came into view slowly, set back from the road, partially hidden by overgrown trees. It looked worse than I remembered. The front porch sagged slightly, paint peeling, windows dark. Condemned. That word fit. I parked at the edge of the driveway and sat there for a moment. This was mine. Not the money, not the accounts. This. I should have felt disappointed. I should have felt cheated. Instead, I felt something else. Curiosity. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. Each step was slow, deliberate, like I was approaching something that had been waiting for me. I reached the front door and rested my hand on the handle, cold metal under my palm. I could walk away, call a realtor, list it, be done. That was what they expected. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, dust in the air. A faint smell of damp wood. I stepped inside. No electricity. Just light filtering through the windows in thin strips. The floor groaned under my weight. I stood in the middle of the room and looked around. Something about it felt off. Not just neglected. Wrong. I couldn't explain it yet, but I felt it. I exhaled slowly. "I'm not selling this place," I said out loud, the words sounding strange in the empty space. The decision settled in my chest, quiet but solid. For the first time since we left that office, I felt like I had chosen something. Not reacting. Chosen. And somewhere, far in the back of my mind, a thought formed, slow and steady. If they wanted me to get rid of this house so badly, there was a reason. And I was going to find out what it was. Standing in that house, with dust in the air and silence pressing in from every direction, I had a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. Not fear. Recognition, like I had been here before in a way that had nothing to do with memory. I walked further inside, slow, careful, listening to the way the floor shifted under my weight. Every step sounded louder than it should have, echoing through empty rooms that felt like they had been waiting. There was something about the layout, the angles, the way the hallway narrowed slightly near the back. It didn't feel random. It felt designed. That was the word that came to me, designed. And that was when I thought of her. My Aunt Lydia. I hadn't said her name out loud in years. No one in my family did. Not anymore. When I was younger, she had been more of a presence. Not constant, not warm, but real. She worked with my dad back then, in the financial side of the family business. Investments, accounts, things I didn't understand as a kid, but heard about in passing conversations that always stopped when I entered the room. I remember her voice more than anything. Low, steady, direct. She didn't soften things the way my mom did. She didn't smile to make people comfortable. She said things the way they were. That alone made her different. And in my family, differences never lasted long. She died when I was 10. That's what they told me. It was an accident. That was the word they used. I remember standing in the kitchen when I overheard it. My mom on the phone, voice quiet but tense. It was sudden. That was all I caught before she noticed me. After that, no one talked about it. No details. No stories. No grief that I could see. Just absence. That silence feels louder now than anything they could have said. I walked into what used to be the living room and ran my hand along the wall where the paint had started to peel. My Aunt Lydia had worked with numbers, with accounts, with records, and from what I understand now, she had been very good at it. Too good. That was what my grandma had once told me, years after Lydia was gone. I hadn't thought about that conversation in a long time. It came back to me now in pieces, like something my mind had filed away for later. I was 16, sitting at my grandma's kitchen table. She was slicing apples, slow, careful, like she always did. You remind me of her, she had said. I didn't know what she meant at the time. Of who? I asked. She paused. Lydia. I remember looking up, surprised. No one said that name. In what way? My grandma didn't answer right away. She set the knife down, wiped her hands on a towel. You notice things, she said finally. Things other people prefer not to see. At 16, that didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a warning. I didn't understand it then. I do now. I moved toward the back of the house, past a narrow hallway that felt tighter than it should have. The air was cooler there. Still, I tried one of the doors. It didn't open. Locked. I stood there for a moment, hand resting on the knob. There was something about that feeling again, not fear, familiarity. I stepped back. My Aunt Lydia had noticed things. That much I was sure of now. And at some point, she had noticed something she wasn't supposed to. That was the part my family never said out loud, but it showed up in other ways. In the way my mom would change the subject if her name came up. In the way my dad would go quiet, more than usual. In the way Victoria reacted. Victoria didn't just avoid talking about Lydia, she dismissed her. Once, when I was in college, I had asked about her directly. I don't even remember why. Something had come up in a class about family-owned businesses and internal fraud, and it made me think of her. Victoria had looked at me like I had asked something ridiculous. She wasn't stable, she said. Just like that. No explanation, no hesitation, unstable. That word again. It followed Lydia the same way it followed me. I didn't catch it then. Or maybe I did and chose not to push. It was easier not to push. Pushing always led to the same place. Cynthia is imagining things. Cynthia is sensitive. Cynthia is difficult. I had learned the script early, so I stopped asking. I walked back toward the front of the house, the boards creaking under my feet. My reflection caught in a dusty mirror leaning against the wall. For a second, I didn't recognize it. Not because it looked different, because it looked familiar in a way that felt misplaced. Same eyes, same shape of the face. I had seen that face before in old photographs my grandma kept in a box she didn't show anyone else. Photographs of Lydia. There had been one in particular. Black and white, slightly faded. She was standing outside, hair pulled back, looking directly at the camera with an expression that wasn't smiling but wasn't cold either. Certain, that was the word. Certain. My grandma had caught me looking at it once. You have her face, she had said. At the time, I thought she meant it as something neutral. Now I think she knew exactly what it meant. I turned away from the mirror. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Victoria, of course. I let it ring for a second longer than necessary before answering. Did you go to the house? She asked. No greeting, no pause. Yes. There was a brief silence on the line. You should really consider selling it as soon as possible, she said. It's not worth the trouble. There it was again. That push. That urgency didn't quite match the situation. I leaned against the wall, feeling the uneven surface under my shoulder. Why are you so concerned about what I do with it? Another pause. I could almost hear her recalibrating. I'm not concerned, she said. I'm being practical. You don't have the resources to fix something like that. Practical. That word sounded a lot like reasonable, like logical. The same tone she used 3 days ago. You don't deserve more than this. I glanced down the hallway again, toward the locked door. Maybe, I said slowly. I want to keep it. She exhaled softly, not quite a sigh. That would be a mistake. Of all the things she could have said, that was the one that stayed with me. A mistake, not inconvenient, not difficult. A mistake. I almost smiled. I'll manage, I said. There was a shift in her tone then, subtle, controlled. Just don't come back later asking for help. I won't. We both knew that wasn't the point. We ended the call without another word. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stood there in the quiet house. The calls started that same night. I had barely gotten home, kicked off my shoes, and set the folder down on the kitchen counter when my phone lit up. Victoria. I let it ring. It stopped, then started again. And again, 3 times in a row. That was new. Victoria didn't repeat herself. Not like that. I picked up on the 4th call. What? No greeting, no softness. You've had time to think, she said. Have you contacted a realtor yet? I leaned against the counter, staring at the reflection of my kitchen light in the window. No. There was a pause. Not surprising, not confusion, annoyance. You're wasting time, Cynthia. Time for what? For fixing a mistake. There it was again, that word, mistake. I could almost hear it echo in that empty house. I'm not selling it, I said. Silence. Longer this time. Then a shift. You don't understand what you're dealing with, she said, her voice lower now, less polished. I almost laughed. No, I said, I don't think I do. But I'm going to find out. She exhaled sharply. You always do this. Do what? Turn something simple into something complicated. That line was familiar. I had heard it in different forms my entire life. You're overthinking. You're making it worse. You're imagining things. I stayed quiet. That used to be the part where I explained myself. Tried to make it make sense. Not this time. Victoria filled the silence. Look, she said, softer now, almost reasonable again. You don't have the money to fix that place. The city will fine you. It's already in bad condition. Just sell it and move on. There it was. The first piece that didn't come from her opinion. The city will fine you. I straightened slightly. What do you mean? Another pause. Nothing, she said quickly, just general code violations. It's an old property. I looked down at the folder on the counter. General. That wasn't how she usually spoke about details. I'll handle it, I said. You can't handle it. Her voice sharpened then, just enough to break through the calm surface. You've never handled anything like this. That landed differently than she probably intended. Because she wasn't wrong. I hadn't. Not because I couldn't. Because I had never been allowed to. I'll figure it out, I said. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was calculating. Then her voice changed again. Fine. One word. Flat. But underneath it, something else. Something colder. Don't come back asking for help when this goes bad. I won't. We ended the call. I set my phone down and stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet of my own apartment. The hum of the refrigerator. A car passing outside. Normal sounds. But something had shifted. It wasn't just pressure anymore, it was urgent. And it wasn't about helping me, it was about stopping me. The next morning, at 9:23, I got a letter. Official envelope. City seal in the corner. I opened it at the kitchen table. Notice of violation. Multiple code issues. Structural instability. Electrical hazards. Water damage. A list that ran nearly 2 pages. At the bottom, a deadline. Failure to address these issues within 30 days may result in fines, additional penalties, or forced action. 30 days. I read it twice, then a third time. The timing was precise. 3 days after I took ownership. Before I had even stepped foot in the house for a proper inspection, I leaned back in my chair. Coincidence. That was what I would have called it a week ago. Now it felt like something else. I folded the letter and set it next to the folder. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered. Miss Pierce. The voice was smooth, professional. Yes. I understand you recently acquired the property on Hollow Creek Road. I felt my jaw tighten slightly. Who is this? My name is Thomas Reed. I represent a client interested in purchasing the property. Of course, that didn't take long. I'm not selling, I said. A brief pause. We're prepared to offer a very competitive price, given the current condition of the property. Competitive. I almost smiled. How much? He named a number. It was low, not insulting, not obvious, but low enough to tell me exactly what they thought the house was worth, or what they wanted me to believe it was worth. I'm not selling, I repeated. The tone on the other end shifted just slightly. You may want to reconsider. Properties in that condition can become liabilities very quickly. Liabilities. Another word that sounded reasonable, another word that carried weight. I'll take my chances, I said. A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, if anything changes, please don't hesitate to reach out. The call ended. I set my phone down and stared at it for a moment. Then I laughed. Soft. Short. Of all the things that could have happened after that meeting, this was the most predictable. Pressure from the family. Pressure from outside. And all of it centered on one thing. Sell the house. I set my phone down on the counter. The folder was still there. The city notice next to it. 3 days of ownership and already 2 threats and an offer. I looked at my hands, still steady, but for the first time I wasn't sure how long that would last. I drove back out to Hollow Creek that afternoon. The sky was overcast, the kind that makes everything look a little flatter, a little more muted. When I pulled into the driveway, something felt off immediately. The front door was slightly ajar. I knew I had closed it, locked it. I stood there for a moment, key still in my hand. Then I walked up slowly and pushed it open. The smell hit me first, stronger than before. Damp, metallic. I stepped inside. The air felt heavier. I moved through the house carefully, listening. Nothing, no movement, no voices. But things were different, subtle. The panel near the hallway had been disturbed, not broken, just shifted slightly like someone had tested it. In the kitchen, a cabinet door hung open that I was sure I had closed. I walked to the sink and turned the faucet. Nothing, no water. I tried again, a dry click. Then silence. I frowned. That hadn't been an issue yesterday. I stepped back, scanning the room. Electrical panel. I walked over and opened it. 2 breakers had been flipped. I stared at them for a second, then reached out and switched them back. The lights flickered weakly, then steadied. Not a power outage, not a failure, a choice. I exhaled slowly. Small things. Easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. But together, they formed a pattern. I pulled my phone out and dialed. Victoria answered on the second ring. What now? I leaned against the counter, eyes on the open electrical panel. Did you send someone to the house? What? To check it. To look around. No. Her answer came too fast. I let the silence stretch. Then I spoke again. The water isn't working. The breakers were flipped. Another pause. Longer this time. It's an old house, Cynthia. Things break. Things don't flip themselves off, I said. Her tone shifted again, sharp. I don't know what you want me to say. The truth would be a good start. A small laugh on her end. Not amused. You're doing it again. Doing what? Turning nothing into something. I closed my eyes for a second. There it was. The pattern. You're imagining things. You're overthinking. You're unstable. I opened my eyes and looked around the room. Empty. Quiet. Controlled. No, I said quietly. I think I'm starting to see something. She didn't respond, but I could feel it. The tension. The shift. If you're trying to scare me into selling, I said, it's not going to work. Another silence. Then, very softly, you should be careful. Not concern. Not warning. Something else. Something closer to a threat. About what? About making the wrong decision. The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, phone still in my hand. The house creaked slightly, settling, or shifting. I wasn't sure anymore. My grandma's voice came back to me then, not from when I was 16, from later, much later, a year before she passed. We were sitting in her living room, late afternoon, the light coming through the curtains in that soft, filtered way she liked. She had been quieter than usual that day. Tired, I thought. Now I think she was careful. There are things you don't know yet, she said, about Lydia. She reached for my hand, steadier than my mom ever held it. They told a story about her, the kind that makes everything that comes after it easier to explain. And they're going to try to tell a story about you too. I had nodded then. I always nodded. Now I understood what she had been giving me. Not comfort. A map. I walked back into the hallway and looked at the locked door again, the one that hadn't opened yesterday, the one that still wouldn't open now. I reached out and pressed my hand against it, solid, unmoving. Whatever was behind it, it had been there for a long time, long before me, long before this week. I stepped back slowly. The calls, the offers, the violations, the small changes inside the house. None of it was random. None of it was about helping me. It was about pressure, controlled, directed, increasing. They needed me to sell, not eventually, now. I looked around the house one more time. The walls, the wiring, the spaces that didn't quite make sense. Then I looked back at the door, and for the first time, the thought came to me clearly. Not just that I had stepped into something, but that by not selling, by staying, by asking questions, I was in the way. And whatever they had planned for this house, I was starting to interfere with it. That realization didn't make me leave. It made me slow down. I stood there in the hallway a little longer, looking at the door that wouldn't open, letting the silence settle around me. Most people, I think, would have walked out at that point, called someone, listed the property, let it go. I didn't. Not because I was brave, because something about it didn't feel new. It felt familiar. That was the part I couldn't explain. I turned away from the door and walked back into the main room, my steps quieter now, more deliberate. If this place was built to hide something, then it wasn't going to show itself all at once. I needed to look at it differently, not as a house, as a system. I started with the walls. I ran my hand along them slowly, pressing in certain spots, tapping lightly with my knuckles. Most of it sounded solid, but not all of it. Near the center of the living room, there was a section that felt different. Not hollow exactly, but less dense. I stepped back and looked at the room again. The proportions were off. The exterior wall should have aligned differently with the interior space. I walked outside, circled the house, counting steps, measuring distance in my head the way I used to when I was younger, and trying to make sense of things no one would explain to me. When I came back inside, I stood in the same spot again. There was space missing, not visually, structurally. I felt a small, quiet sense of satisfaction, not excitement, just confirmation. I moved on. The electrical panel was next. I opened it again, this time paying closer attention. The wiring didn't follow a clean pattern. Lines crossed in ways they didn't need to. Some circuits were labeled, others weren't. I traced one of the wires with my eyes, following where it should have gone. It disappeared into the wall. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was where it didn't reappear. I checked the outlets in the nearby rooms. Some worked, some didn't, not in a way that suggested neglect, in a way that suggested control. Certain areas were powered, others were isolated. I stood there staring at the panel. This wasn't random. This wasn't just an old house falling apart. This was intentional. I closed the panel slowly. The house creaked again, a soft shift in the wood. Or something else. I wasn't sure. I walked back down the hallway. The air felt cooler again. Still, that same feeling settled over me. Not fear. Recognition. Like my body understood something my mind hadn't fully caught up to yet. I stopped in front of the locked door. I reached out and pressed my palm flat against it. For a second, nothing. Then a sensation I couldn't quite name. A memory, but not visual. Physical. Like being in a space too small. Like being watched. I pulled my hand back. That was new. I stood there, breathing slowly, trying to ground myself in what I could actually see. Wood. Paint. A simple door. Nothing more. And yet, I stepped back and turned away. I needed another set of eyes on this. Someone who looked at structures, not stories. I pulled out my phone and scrolled until I found the number. Harold. He answered on the third ring. Yeah, it's Cynthia. A pause. From yesterday. Yeah, I remember. I could hear background noise. Tools. Metal against concrete. You are still working today? Depends. What do you need? I glanced around the house again. Everything. He let out a short breath. That sounds expensive. It probably is. Another pause. You got a specific problem? Yes. I looked at the wall in the living room. I think something in this house was built wrong. Silence. Then, what kind of wrong? I thought about how to explain it. Not broken. Designed. He didn't respond right away. Then he said, I can come take a look. Give me an hour. I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket. The wait felt longer than it was. I walked through the house again while I waited. Same rooms, same walls. But now I was seeing them differently, not as empty spaces, as parts of something connected. I stood in the kitchen for a while, listening to the quiet, letting my thoughts settle. By the time I heard the truck pull into the driveway, I was ready. Harold stepped inside a few minutes later, carrying a small toolbox. He looked around, slower this time than yesterday, taking it in. You weren't kidding, he said. About what? This place. He set the toolbox down and walked into the living room. Something about it, he added. I nodded. That's what I'm trying to figure out. He started with the basics. Checking the pipes under the sink, testing the pressure. Then the electrical panel, same things I had looked at, but with a different kind of focus. Practical, grounded. He didn't talk much at first, just worked. Every so often, he would stop, look at something a little longer than expected, then move on. Eventually, he stood in the middle of the living room, hands on his hips. You're right, he said. About what? This ain't normal. I felt that same quiet confirmation again. What isn't? He walked over to the wall I had been looking at earlier and knocked on it. Once, twice, then again in a slightly different spot. The sound changed, not by much, but enough. Hear that? I stepped closer. He knocked again, solid, then a few inches over. Different. I nodded. I noticed. He looked at me then, really looked. You have been checking this place yourself. Yes. He nodded slowly. That explains it. Explains what? Most people wouldn't catch this. I almost smiled. Most people didn't grow up in a house where nothing made sense. He crouched down and ran his hand along the base of the wall. There's space behind here, not a lot, but more than there should be. I felt my chest tighten slightly. How much? Hard to say without opening it. The word hung in the air. Opening. He stood up. You want me to check the pipes back here first? No. The answer came faster than I expected. He paused. You sure? Yes. I stepped closer to the wall. If there's something behind it, I want to see it. He studied my face for a moment, like he was trying to decide if I understood what I was asking. You know, once we open that, there's no putting it back the same way. I nodded. I know. Another pause. This one longer. Then he sighed quietly. All right. He walked back to his toolbox and pulled out a few tools, set them down carefully, measured the wall with his eyes, picked the spot, then stopped. He turned back to me. You might want to step back. I didn't move. Do it. He hesitated, just for a second. Then he lifted the tool and placed it against the wall. The first cut was quiet, controlled. A small line, then another. Dust falling to the floor in thin streams. The sound echoed through the house, louder than it should have been. Or maybe I was just hearing it differently. He worked slowly, methodical, carving out a section piece by piece. I watched every movement, every shift, every sound. My heartbeat stayed steady. That surprised me. After a few minutes, he stopped, set the tool down, and just looked at what he had opened. His expression changed, not dramatically, just enough. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer right away. He leaned in slightly, peering into the space behind the wall. Then he straightened up slowly. Miss Cynthia. His voice was different now, lower. Careful. You might want to come look at this. I stepped forward, slow, measured, like I was walking towards something I had already been expecting. I reached the opening and looked inside, and for a moment I didn't say anything. Because whatever I thought I was going to find, it wasn't this. I turned my head slightly toward him, and for the first time since he arrived, I saw hesitation in his face. Real hesitation. Like he wasn't sure if he should have opened it at all. I leaned in closer and looked again. Stacks. Neat. Tight, wrapped, cash, not scattered, not shoved in as an afterthought, placed. Behind it, black boxes, wires running into the wall like veins, small blinking lights that made the space feel alive in a way it shouldn't have. For a second, everything went very quiet in my head. Not blank. Clear. This wasn't something left behind. This was something maintained. How long has this been here? I asked. Harold shook his head slowly. I don't know. But it's not new. He crouched down again, careful not to touch anything. There's more behind this. Looks like it goes deeper. I didn't move. I didn't reach out. I just stood there and looked at it. My name. That was the part that hadn't shown up yet. But I knew it would, because this wasn't about hiding money. This was about placing it somewhere it could be found, by the right person, at the right time. I straightened. Call the police, Harold said quietly. I pulled my phone out and glanced at the time. 7:02 in the morning. That was when he had called me, which meant someone else had already made that call. Before the wall was open, before anything was found, they already knew. He looked at me, confused. I pulled my phone out and glanced at the time, 7:02 in the morning. That was when he had called me, which meant someone else had already been here, or someone had already known. The sound of tires on gravel broke the silence. Harold stood up slowly. You expecting anyone? No. We both turned toward the front door. Boots on wood. Voices. Low. Controlled. Police. They moved through the house quickly, efficiently. One of them stopped at the opening in the wall, crouched down, took in the scene without reacting. The other turned to me. You, the owner. Yes. Name. Cynthia. He nodded, like he already knew. Step back for me. I did. One step. Then another. And in those 2 steps, something settled into place that I understood would not unsettle again. Whatever had been in that wall had been there long before I owned this house. Long before I signed anything. Long before I walked through that door for the first time. And my name was already on it. That was not something I could explain away. Not something I could manage quietly. Not something I could make smaller by staying calm and nodding and waiting for it to pass. This was the kind of thing that changed what came next. Harold moved beside me, quiet now. The officers spoke to each other in short, clipped phrases. Words I couldn't quite make out but understood the meaning of. Evidence. Scene. Secure. It didn't feel chaotic. It felt procedural. That was worse, because procedures meant this fit into something they already recognized, not something new. One of the officers stood and walked toward me. We're going to need to ask you a few questions. Of course, my voice came out steady. Too steady, maybe. He studied me for a second, then nodded toward the kitchen. Let's sit. I walked ahead of him this time, sat down at the same chair as before, same position, same table. The room hadn't changed, but everything inside it had. You've had this property how long? He asked. 3 days. And you weren't aware of any of this? No. He wrote something down, then looked up again. Who else has access to the property? I opened my mouth, then stopped, because I already knew how that question would be used. Access meant opportunity. Opportunity meant responsibility. Responsibility would circle back to me. No one, I said, not recently. He nodded again. Like that answer fits. Of course it did. It was the answer they expected. Before he could ask the next question, I heard another voice. Soft. Trembling. Cynthia. My mom. I didn't turn right away. I didn't need to. I could already picture her. Hands clasped. Eyes wet. Voice just above a whisper. I turned slowly. She stood in the doorway, one hand pressed lightly against the frame like she needed support. My dad stood just behind her. Still. Watching. Victoria was a step ahead of him, already inside the room, already assessing. Her eyes moved from me to the officer, then to the hallway where the wall had been opened. She took it all in quickly, faster than anyone else. Then she looked at me, concern, carefully measured. What happened? She asked. I held her gaze. You tell me. A flicker, small, gone almost immediately. My mom stepped closer. Are you okay? I nodded. I always nod. She reached out like she was going to touch my arm, then stopped halfway. The officer cleared his throat. And you are? Family? Victoria said smoothly. I'm her sister. Of course she spoke first. The officer gave a short nod. We're in the middle of an investigation. We understand, she said. We just want to make sure she's all right. She, not me. My mom let out a soft, uneven breath. She's been under a lot of stress lately. There it was, the first piece, small, gentle, placed carefully. The officer glanced at me. What kind of stress? My mom hesitated, like she didn't want to say too much, like she was protecting me. It's been a difficult few years, she said quietly. She's had some challenges. Challenges. Another word. Soft. Harmless. But it carried weight. Victoria stepped in. She's been struggling with anxiety, she said. We've been trying to get her help. My jaw tightened slightly. This was happening faster than I expected. My dad spoke then. First time. Low. Controlled. She's had episodes. The room felt smaller. The officer looked between them. And you are? Her dad. He nodded. We just want to make sure this is handled appropriately. Appropriately. I almost laughed. Inside. Not out loud, because I could see it now. The structure. The same one my grandma had warned me about. You create a story, you place small details, you let other people fill in the rest. I leaned back slightly in the chair. My hands were still resting on the table, not shaking. That still surprised me. What kind of episodes? The officer asked. My mom looked down like this was painful for her to say. Sometimes she sees things that aren't there. My chest tightened, not from fear, from recognition. I remembered sitting in a small office when I was younger, a doctor across from me, my mom beside me. She's been having trouble distinguishing reality from imagination, my mom had said back then. I had been 12. I remembered the office clearly. The way the chair felt too big, the way my feet didn't quite touch the floor. I had tried to explain what I saw, what I heard. My mom had sat very still beside me the whole time, hands folded, expression soft with concern. The more I explained, the worse it sounded. I understood now why. She had already told him what to hear before I opened my mouth. That was the trick. You let someone speak, then you frame what they say. My voice came out calm. That's not accurate. Victoria tilted her head slightly. Cynthia, she said softly. There it was, that tone, the one that sounded patient, understanding, condescending. You don't have to do this right now. Do what? Make it worse. I held her gaze. You mean defend myself? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The officer looked down at his notes again. Have you ever been treated for any mental health conditions? Yes. I didn't hesitate. That surprised them. It showed. Briefly. My mom's eyes flickered. Victoria's expression shifted just slightly. My dad still said nothing. For anxiety, I continued. Years ago. That was true. It was also incomplete, but I wasn't going to fill in the rest for them. The officer nodded. Any hospitalizations? No. Another note. I could feel the direction this was going. Not directly. Carefully, like everything else. One of the other officers stepped into the doorway. We found documents with her name on them. There it was, the second piece, placed. The officer in front of me looked up. We're going to need to verify some things. Of course. My voice stayed even. Inside, something else was forming. Not panic, not confusion, understanding. They had already written this. Before today. Before the wall. Before the police. My name on documents. Money in the walls. History of instability. It all fit. Too well. I leaned forward slightly. Can I see the documents? He hesitated. Then nodded. A few minutes later, they brought one over. A folder. Clean. Organized. I opened it. My name printed clearly. Cynthia Pierce. Account numbers. Transactions. Dates. Some recent. Some older. All tied together in a way that looked deliberate. Convincing. My eyes moved to the bottom of one page. Signature. Mine. Or something very close to it. I stared at it for a long moment. I had never signed that. But it looked like I had. The officer watched my face. Recognizing anything, I looked up. No. And that was the truth. Not the one they expected. The real one. Behind me, I could feel my family. Not physically, but their presence, their expectations. This is the part where she breaks. This is the part where she contradicts herself. This is the part where the story becomes real. I closed the folder and set it down carefully. I understand how this looks, I said. The officer didn't respond. Because he didn't need to. It looked exactly the way it was supposed to. I leaned back in my chair again, slow, controlled. And in that moment, everything aligned. Lydia, unstable, removed. Me, unstable, framed. Same structure, different time. I exhaled quietly. They didn't just plan this, they had done it before. And now they were doing it again. The realization didn't come with panic, it came with clarity. I sat there a few seconds longer, letting the room settle around me, letting their version of me hang in the air like something already decided. Then I stood up. I didn't ask permission. I didn't explain. I just said I need some air and walked out before anyone could stop me. No one did. That told me more than anything else. If they really believed I was unstable, they would have followed, watched, controlled. Instead, they let me go. Because they thought I was already contained. The cold came through my jacket slowly. I was still sitting on the steps when I finally understood it. This house wasn't a mistake on their part. It wasn't the consolation prize. It wasn't the leftover. It was the setup. The place they needed me to be standing when everything came down. It wasn't a gift. It was a stage. I sat down on the front steps, not because my legs gave out, because something needed a moment to settle. The whole thing was clear now, and clear was not the same as fine, my name on those documents. My history, recited in that kitchen like a file someone had prepared in advance. My mom's hand on my arm, right up until it wasn't. I had been a character in their story for so long that I had forgotten I was also a person in mine. I sat there until the cold came through my jacket, until my hands stopped feeling like they needed to do something, until the only thought left was one question. What do I actually know that they don't know I know? That was when I thought of Rachel. I got in the car and drove. Not home, not anywhere familiar, somewhere else. Somewhere that had existed in the back of my mind for years without a name I was willing to say out loud. Dr. Rachel Whitaker. I hadn't let myself think about her directly, just in fragments. A quiet office, soft lighting, a voice that didn't rush me toward a conclusion someone else had already written. She had been the only one in that process who paused before she agreed with them. She hadn't disagreed, not openly, but she had paused. At the time, I didn't understand why that mattered. Now I did. I found the address after a few minutes of searching. Same building, different time. I parked and sat there for a second before going in. Not because I was nervous, because I was deciding. Once I walked in, I wasn't asking for help. I was looking for evidence. That was different. The receptionist looked up when I entered. "Can I help you?" I nodded. "I'm looking for Dr. Rachel Whitaker." She checked something on her screen. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." She hesitated, then looked at me again, a little more carefully this time. "Let me see if she's available." I sat down in the waiting area. Same chairs. Same neutral colors. It felt smaller now. Or maybe I was just seeing it differently. A few minutes later, a door opened, and there she was. Older, subtly, but the same. She looked at me for a moment, longer than most people would, like she was placing something. "Cynthia," she said. I nodded. I wasn't sure if she remembered me or if she had just read my name. Either way, it didn't matter. She stepped aside. "Come in." Her office was almost exactly the way I remembered it. Same desk, same chair, same soft light. I sat down. She didn't speak right away. She waited. That was the first thing I remembered about her. She let silence exist. Most people rushed to fill it. She didn't. "What brings you back?" she asked finally. Her tone was calm, neutral, not assuming anything. I studied her for a second, then I said it plainly. "I need my records." A small shift in her expression, not surprise, recognition. "That's not usually why people come back," she said. "I know." Another pause. Then she leaned back slightly. "Why now?" I thought about how much to say. Not everything. Not yet. Because I didn't need her to understand the whole story. Just this part. Because I think they changed them. Her eyes sharpened slightly, not visibly to anyone else, but I saw it. That word. Changed. That was different from confused. Different from misremembered. Changed. That implied intention. She didn't answer right away. She stood up instead and walked to a cabinet behind her desk, unlocked it, pulled out a file, set it down between us. "This is what we have on record," she said. I didn't reach for it immediately. I looked at her. "Is that everything?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then she said, "No." That was enough. I opened the file. Paper. Notes. Typed summaries. Handwritten observations. I flipped through them slowly, not rushing, looking for patterns. Looking for what I already suspected. It didn't take long. Certain phrases repeated. Certain descriptions that didn't match the memory I had of those sessions. Distorted. Subtle, but enough. I turned a page, then another, and then I stopped. There. A note. Handwritten. Not part of the official summary. Short. Careful. Patient appears coherent and consistent. Family narrative does not fully align with observed behavior. I looked up. She was watching me. You wrote this, I said. Yes. Why isn't it in the official record? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked back to the cabinet and opened a different drawer. Took out another folder. Older. Worn. She placed it on the desk. Because this one is. I opened it. The difference was immediate. Less polished. More real. Observations that weren't filtered through anything. Session notes that reflected what actually happened. Not what someone wanted them to say. I read quickly now. Faster. Because the pattern was clear. They had edited the narrative. Not completely. Just enough. Remove doubt. Add instability. Shift perception. My hands stayed steady as I turned the pages. But something else moved inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. Then I saw it. A note from one of the later sessions. Medication discussed at request of family. Patient expressed confusion regarding necessity. My breath slowed. I remembered that. Not clearly. But enough. A glass of water. A small white pill. My mom standing in the doorway. Just take it, she had said. It will help you calm down. I had asked what it was. She hadn't answered. I took it anyway, because that was easier than not taking it. I closed my eyes for a second. Another memory surfaced. Not visual, physical. The feeling of heaviness, like my body didn't belong to me, like my thoughts were slower than they should have been. I opened my eyes again. They gave me medication, I said. She nodded once. Yes, without your informed consent. The words landed differently than I expected. Not dramatic, precise, like a piece of something clicking into place. I turned another page. Audio notation. Session recorded at family request. I looked up sharply. They recorded it. She held my gaze. Yes. I sat back slowly. Everything I had said, every hesitation, every moment of confusion, captured, then interpreted, then rewritten, to fit. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. So when they say I had episodes, she nodded. They have material that supports that claim. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was clean, too clean. A system, designed with the same intention as everything else they had built. The house. The hidden space in the walls. This. All of it made by the same hand, for the same purpose. To hold something in place until it was needed. I closed the file and rested my hands on it. For a long moment, I didn't speak. Neither did she. Then I said it. Quiet. Steady. There's nothing wrong with me. She didn't rush to agree. That was important. She just said, no, there isn't. Something in my chest shifted, not dramatically, not like relief, like alignment, like something that had been slightly off for years finally settling into place. I nodded once. That was enough. I stood up. She didn't stop me, just watched. You're not asking for help, she said. No. You're confirming something. Yes. She gave a small nod. Then be careful. That was the only warning. I picked up the second folder, the real one, and held it for a second. Then I looked at her. Thank you. She didn't respond, not with words, just a look that said she understood more than she was saying. I walked out of the office with the file in my hand. The hallway felt different, not lighter, sharper, defined. When I stepped outside, the air felt the same as before. Cold. Real. But I wasn't the same. What they had built around me was real, which meant it could come apart. I stood there for a moment, looking down at the file, then back at my car. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was deciding. And that was where everything began to change. I drove straight back from Rachel's office. The file was on the passenger seat. I didn't look at it again. I didn't need to. Everything in it had already settled somewhere it wouldn't move from. When I got back to the house, it no longer felt like something I had inherited. It felt like something I had stepped into, not accidentally, not recently, something that had been waiting. There were more cars parked outside now, not just local police, different plates, unmarked vehicles, people moving in and out of the house with a kind of quiet focus that didn't need to be explained. The air around the place had shifted. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was direction. I stepped out of my car and walked up the driveway slowly, taking in the details I had missed before. Two men near the front porch speaking in low voices, one pointing toward the living room, the other writing something down without looking up. Another agent near the side of the house photographing the exterior wall, measuring distances like he was reconstructing something that had already happened. The front door was open, wider than before, like the house itself had been forced to reveal more than it was meant to. An officer stepped in front of me as I approached. "Ma'am, we need you to stay outside for now." I nodded. "Of course." My voice came out calm. It always did. That was something they had never been able to take from me. I stepped back and waited, not pacing, not asking questions, just watching. That seemed to unsettle people more than anything else. After a few minutes, a man approached me, not in uniform, mid-40s, clean, controlled, observant. He held out his hand. "Connor Hale." I shook it. "Cynthia." He nodded like he had already confirmed that. "We need to talk." I followed him a few steps away from the house, far enough that we wouldn't be overheard, close enough that everything remained visible. "You've had quite a morning," he said. "That's one way to describe it." His eyes stayed on me, not searching for weakness, looking for consistency. "Walk me through exactly what happened." I told him, from the beginning. The call. 7:02 in the morning, Harold arriving. The house. The wall. The moment everything changed. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct, just listened. When I finished, he wrote something down, then looked up. "You're certain about the time?" "Yes." 7:02. "Not earlier." "No." He nodded slowly. "That's important. I didn't ask why. I already knew it would matter." "We received a call about suspicious activity at this address before that time," he said. The words settled between us. "Before." I repeated it in my head, not as a question, as confirmation. How much before? A few minutes. Enough to dispatch units. Enough to be on the road. I looked at him. So someone reported something before anything was found. He didn't respond immediately. That's what the timeline suggests. I felt something shift, not surprise. Alignment. This wasn't something that went wrong. This was something that was set. I exhaled slowly, and in that breath, I could see it. The house, the money, the documents, my name, the police, all of it, placed in a sequence that only worked if it happened in a certain order. And someone had made sure it did. "Do you know who might have made that call?" he asked. "Yes." I didn't hesitate. That caught his attention. "Who?" "My sister." He didn't react outwardly, but I saw it. The small shift. "Why?" "Because she already knew about the house." He waited. I continued. "Not just that I had it, what it was, how it worked, the way she pushed me to sell it, immediately, relentlessly, like time mattered." He nodded slightly. "Explain that." "At the will reading," I said, "she wasn't surprised. Not really. She acted like she had already decided what the house meant. And from that moment on, she didn't stop trying to get me to let it go." His expression remained neutral. "And if you had sold it?" I held his gaze. "Then I wouldn't be here." He didn't respond, but that was the answer. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. Opened the call log. Scrolled. Stopped. "This number," I said, showing him. He leaned in, studied it, then looked up. "What about it?" "It's hers, not her main line. The one she uses when she doesn't want something directly connected." He took the phone, looked at it longer this time, then handed it back. "We'll verify that, of course." I slipped it back into my bag. Connor stepped away for a moment, speaking to another agent. Low voice. Short sentences. Efficient. I stayed where I was, watching the house, but not really seeing it, seeing the structure behind it, the one they built around me, and how carefully it had been designed. When he came back, his tone had shifted slightly, more certain. "We pulled the call record," he said, and... He paused. "The number matches." I nodded, not surprised, just confirming what I already knew. So she called it in, I said, before anything was found. Yes. He watched my face, waiting for something, a reaction, a crack. There wasn't one. Because this wasn't the part where I broke. This was the part where it became clear. I looked past him, toward the house, and for a moment I could almost see it the way she must have. Not as a place, as a mechanism. Everything in it placed with intention. Everything timed, even me. They needed me to come back. They needed me to take the house. They needed me to stay long enough. They needed me to open the wall. And they needed the police to arrive at the exact moment when it could no longer be undone. I spoke quietly. She didn't just plan the house. She planned the discovery. Connor didn't interrupt. Inside, an agent walked out carrying a sealed evidence bag. Cash. Another followed with a device. Wires still attached, documented, tagged, everything moving in sequence, like they were reading a script that had already been written. Then another detail surfaced. Connor glanced at a note in his hand. The caller didn't just report suspicious activity. They specifically mentioned concealed currency behind a structural wall. I felt my stomach tighten, not from fear, from precision. That's not something you guess, I said. No, he replied, it isn't, which means she knew exactly what was behind the wall, and where. That landed heavier than anything else so far, because it shifted this from suspicion to direct involvement. I reached into my bag and touched the edge of Rachel's file again. One system, now this. Connected. Connor continued. We're also looking at prior access to the property, permits, contractors, anyone who may have worked on the structure. I didn't wait for him to ask. She handled the estate after Grandma passed, I said. All of it. The transfer paperwork, the contractors, the city filings. Every document that touched this property went through her before it reached anyone else. He looked up. You know this for certain. I was there when the lawyer handed her the folder. She didn't ask what was in it. She already knew where everything went. He wrote that down without speaking. He looked up. All of it. Yes. Another note. Another connection. Then he paused. There's a room at the back of the house. Door was locked from the outside. One of our team got it open this morning. I didn't say anything. I had pressed my hand against that door 3 times and never gotten an answer. He continued. Secondary recording equipment. Older model. Different from what was in the wall. Not staged for discovery. Set up for use. He let that land. Someone had been in that room before you ever had the keys. I already knew who. Connor hesitated before speaking again. There's something else. I waited. The call didn't just come from her number. It was routed through a secondary device registered under a business entity. I felt a flicker of something sharper. Which entity? He met my eyes. One tied to the trust that was supposed to be dissolved. I went very still. That meant the structure wasn't just used to frame me. It was still active, still operating, even after everything. I let out a slow breath. So even the cleanup was part of the plan. Connor didn't answer. He didn't need to. I stood there for a moment, saying nothing. Outside the house, agents moved with the same quiet efficiency as before. Evidence bags, tagged devices, measured distances, all of it moving toward something I hadn't yet seen the end of. I looked back at the house, and for the first time I understood the full shape of it. This wasn't just about removing me. It was about replacing me with a version that could carry everything they needed. A name, a liability, a story. And once that story was complete, I wouldn't exist in any way that mattered. I looked back at Connor. This isn't just a setup. It's a system they've been using. He nodded once. We're bringing in federal. The word didn't surprise me. It confirmed scale, financial crimes, interstate movement, coordinated fraud. This isn't just local anymore. I glanced at the house again. It never was. He studied me for a moment. You're very certain, because I've seen this before. That part landed differently. He didn't ask right away. Then, where? In my family. A brief silence. Then he nodded. Understood. I stood there, feeling the ground under my feet in a way I hadn't before. Not shifting, not uncertain, solid. For the first time, I wasn't inside their story. I was outside it, watching it unfold. I didn't know yet if what I had was enough. Rachel's file. The number, the timeline. The room at the back of the house. But I knew one thing they didn't. They had built this to end with me contained, and I was still standing outside it, holding the pieces they forgot I could find. That was enough to start. 3 weeks passed between Connor's call and the first day of hearing. 3 weeks of nothing that looked like anything from the outside. Work. Routine. The house still marked where walls had been opened. I didn't talk to my family, not once. They didn't reach out either. That told me everything about how certain they were. The courtroom felt smaller than I expected, not physically, structurally. Like everything that had been hidden for years was being forced into a space that couldn't contain it anymore. I sat at the table, hands folded in front of me, the file from Rachel resting just within reach. Across the room, my family sat together. Close. Contained. Like they always had been. My mom looked smaller than usual. Not fragile. Careful. My dad sat upright, shoulders squared, expression controlled the way it had always been when something mattered. Victoria didn't look at me. Not once. She watched the room instead. Measured. Calculated. Still trying to understand where the shift had happened. Connor sat a few seats away, speaking quietly with another agent. Federal. That word had changed everything. The room settled as the proceedings began. No dramatic opening, no raised voices. Just a steady, methodical unraveling. I had expected something louder than this. But truth, when it finally surfaces, doesn't need volume. It just needs to be placed correctly. And the prosecutor was placing it correctly. The first layer was financial. Documents entered into evidence. Accounts, transfers, amounts that didn't match reported income, patterns that didn't belong to a single person, but to a system. The prosecutor spoke calmly, walking through it step by step, each piece building on the last. No rush, no gaps. I watched Victoria as the numbers were read out. Not for reaction, for recognition. She understood every line. That was clear. Her expression didn't break, but it tightened. Slightly. That was enough. Then came the signatures. Pages displayed. Side-by-side comparisons. Mine. Or what looked like mine. I didn't move. Didn't react. Because I had already seen them. Already understood what they were meant to do. The expert spoke about consistency, pressure patterns, stroke order, then paused, and pointed out the discrepancies, subtle but real, enough to say what needed to be said. These signatures were not written by the same hand. The room shifted, not visibly, but I felt it, the first crack. My mom's hand moved to her chest, not dramatically, just a small movement, like she needed to remind herself to breathe. My dad didn't move at all. Victoria finally looked at the documents, only for a second, then back up. Still composed, still holding the line. The next layer came quietly. Medical records, 2 sets, one official, one original, Rachel's work. Placed carefully into evidence, the difference wasn't dramatic at first glance. That was the point. Small changes. Words adjusted. Observations reframed. The prosecutor didn't explain it all at once. He let the contrast sit there, side by side, until it became undeniable. The narrative had been altered, not invented, edited. And editing, in this case, had purpose. My name appeared again. Cynthia Pierce. Descriptions, diagnoses suggested, behavior interpreted, then compared to the original notes. Coherent, consistent, misrepresented. I felt something settle deeper inside me, not relief, confirmation. Rachel sat in the witness seat, calm, steady. She answered every question without hesitation, without embellishment. She didn't defend me, she stated facts. That mattered more. Were the official records accurate? No. Were they modified? Yes. At whose request? Family. The word landed without emphasis, but it carried everything. My mom looked down. My dad's jaw tightened. Victoria didn't move. Not yet. The next piece came with less warning. Audio. The courtroom shifted slightly as the recording was introduced, a small device. Placed on the table. The judge nodded. Proceed. The sound that filled the room was softer than I expected. My voice. Younger. Slower. There was a delay in it. A wait. Like every word had to move through something before it could reach the surface. I recognized it immediately. Not the words. The feeling. Medication. The prosecutor didn't interrupt the recording. He let it play. My voice asking questions. Simple ones. What is this? Why do I need it? Then another voice. My mom. Calm. Reassuring. Just take it. It will help you. The tone was familiar. gentle, convincing, the kind that made resistance feel unreasonable. The recording continued. My voice again, slower now, uncertain, then silence, the kind that doesn't belong in a conversation. The recording ended, no explanation, none needed. I looked at my mom. She was the only one in the room who had not moved at all during the recording, not her hands, not her eyes. She sat perfectly still the way she always had when something needed to look like it wasn't happening. That stillness was its own kind of answer. The room had changed, not in sound, in weight. What had been suggested before was now visible. Not theory, not interpretation, process, method. Victoria shifted slightly in her seat. The first real movement since this started, small. But it broke the stillness she had been holding. The prosecutor moved on. Call logs. Timeline. 7:02 in the morning. Report filed. Before the wall was opened, before anything was found, the number traced, linked, presented, Victoria's second line. This time, she didn't look away. She looked directly at the document, then at the prosecutor, then at Connor. And for a second, something in her expression changed. Not fear, calculation, recalibration, like she was searching for another way to hold the structure together. There wasn't one. The layers were too connected now, too complete. The judge asked a question. Direct, simple. Was the call made from this number? Yes. Verified. No hesitation. No room left. My dad finally spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to be heard. This is a misunderstanding. The words sounded thin, even to him. The prosecutor didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply continued. Because the case didn't need volume. It had structure. Each piece placed. Each connection shown, until the full shape was impossible to ignore. I stood when they asked me to, walked to the witness seat, sat down, hands steady, back straight. The room watched, not with sympathy, with attention. That was different. I didn't rush to speak. I didn't try to convince anyone. I answered what was asked, clearly, simply. Did you sign these documents? No. Were you aware of these accounts? No. Were you aware of the recordings being made? No. Each answer landed clean. No hesitation. No confusion. Because there was none left, the prosecutor paused, then asked one final question. Do you believe these actions were intentional? I looked at him, then at the documents, then at my family. My mom's eyes were wet. My dad's expression had hardened. Victoria was still, composed, but no longer in control. I answered. Yes, not louder, not stronger, just certain. That was enough. I stepped down, walked back to my seat, sat, and waited. The rest unfolded the way things do when they can't be held together anymore. Charges read, specific, clear, financial fraud, forgery, coercion, obstruction. Each one placed exactly where it belonged. No exaggeration, no dramatics, just consequence. My family didn't react the way I had imagined they might. No outburst, no collapse, just a slow, visible loss of control, of narrative, of position, of certainty. That was the real shift, not what they said, what they couldn't say anymore. When it was over, the room didn't feel victorious. It felt resolved, like something that had been stretched too far had finally returned to its shape. I stood up, picked up my bag, the file, everything I had brought with me. No one stopped me. No one called my name. I didn't look at them. Not my mom, not my dad, not Victoria, because there was nothing left there for me to see. I walked out of the courtroom the same way I had walked into it. Steady. Controlled. But something had come loose inside me that I hadn't expected. Not grief. Not anger. Something quieter than both. The kind that surfaces when something you've been carrying for a very long time is finally set down. Outside, the air was cold. I stood on the steps for a moment without moving. Not because I didn't know where to go, because for the first time in as long as I could remember, there was no one watching me decide. I didn't go home that night. I drove until the city thinned out, and then I pulled over and sat with the engine running for a long time. Not because I was lost, because something needed to move through me before I could go anywhere. It wasn't grief. I had expected grief and it didn't come. It was something older than that. The feeling of a door that had been pressed shut for a very long time finally opening from the other side. I sat there until it passed. Then I drove home. The final hearing was 2 weeks later. I arrived early, sat in the same seat. The room was quieter than before. Across from me, my family had separated. That was the first thing I noticed. They were no longer a unit. My dad sat alone, shoulders still squared, but carrying more weight than before. My mom a few seats away, hands folded tight, eyes that couldn't stay still. Victoria at the far end. Same posture, same composure, but the stillness in her now came from a different place, not control. Calculation that had run out of moves. The charges were red. The same ones as before, but this time with names attached. Victoria didn't react, not outwardly, but I saw the moment her breathing changed. Slight, barely visible. That was the only break. My dad's charges followed. Financial crimes. Hidden accounts. Misuse of trust funds. The language was exact. No room for interpretation. My mom. Coercion. Manipulation. Unauthorized administration of medication. That one landed differently. Because it had always been wrapped in something softer, something that sounded like care. Now it was stripped down to what it actually was. The trust was formally dissolved, not restructured, not adjusted, removed. Everything tied to it examined and reassigned under supervision. The system they had built, the one that allowed everything else to exist, was gone, not weakened, gone. When my name came up, it was brief, cleared of liability. No evidence of involvement, no legal responsibility, just facts, simple, direct. The opposite of everything they had tried to build around me. I didn't feel relief. Not the kind people expect. Because relief suggests something was returned. This wasn't return. It was separation. I was no longer connected to what they had made, and that mattered more. When it was over, people moved, papers gathered, chairs shifted. I stayed seated for a moment longer. They had built a life around me. Not with me. Around me. A version where I could be removed, explained away, replaced. The house, the money, the records, the recordings, all of it one system, designed over time, maintained carefully, activated when needed. I was never meant to step outside of it. But I had. And that was the thing they hadn't planned for. Voices low. The room didn't hold on to anything. It released it. Connor passed by me on his way out. He gave a small nod, nothing more. That was enough. I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked toward the exit. No one called my name, no one stopped me, and I didn't look at them. Not because I was avoiding it, because there was nothing left there that belonged to me. Outside, the air felt steady, not sharp, not cold, just real. I stood on the steps for a moment, letting that settle. And for the first time, I noticed something small. No one was watching me leave. For years, every move I made had been observed, interpreted, adjusted. Now, there was nothing. No eyes, no narrative forming around me, just space. I walked to my car and drove away, not back to where I had been, forward. The house looked different when I returned, not because it had changed yet, because I had. The walls were still marked where they had been opened, the wiring still exposed in places, the structure still in transition, but it no longer felt like something designed to contain. It felt like something waiting to be defined. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The sound echoed once, then settled. Quiet. I walked through the room slowly, not searching, not analyzing, just being there. The living room was still open where the wall had been. The space behind it empty now. Visible. Honest. I stood in front of it for a long moment. This was where everything had started to show. Not the truth. The evidence of it. That was different. Truth had been there long before that wall opened. It just hadn't been seen. I ran my hand lightly along the edge of the exposed space. Solid. No hidden layer. No second structure. Just what it was. I turned away and walked through the rest of the house. Room by room, each one holding a different kind of silence now, not the kind that hides, the kind that allows. I stopped in what used to be the smallest room, the one that had felt tight the first time I walked through. Now the wall was gone, the space had opened. Light came in from a window that had always been there, just never reached before. I stood there longer than I expected, because something about it felt personal, not the room, the change. I understood then that what they had done wasn't just about control. It was about defining the limits of what I could see. And now those limits were gone. I called a contractor later that afternoon, not for repairs, for rebuilding. When he arrived, I didn't give him a list. I gave him a direction. I want everything that was used to hide something to be removed. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. We can do that. Work started within days. Walls came down, wiring was redone, spaces opened. Light moved differently through the house with each change. Not forced, not directed, just allowed. I spent time there while it was happening, not supervising, witnessing, watching something that had been built with intention to control slowly become something that no longer held that purpose. At some point, the idea settled in without effort, not something I planned, something that made sense. This place didn't need to be sold. It didn't need to be forgotten. It needed to be repurposed. I started small, a room set aside for conversation, another for quiet, information brought in, resources, not as a business, not as something structured, as a space for people who had been told what they were, who had been shaped by narratives that didn't belong to them, who had been made to question their own reality. I didn't call it anything. Names create expectation. I wanted something without that. Just a place where nothing was rewritten without consent, where no one's voice was adjusted to fit someone else's version, where silence wasn't used against them. That was enough. A few months later, a woman sat across from me in the small room I had set aside for conversation. She had been referred by someone I didn't know. She didn't say much at first, just looked around the room the way people do when they're not sure yet if a space is safe. I let her look. After a while, she said, "I keep being told I'm remembering it wrong." I nodded. "I know what that's like," I said. That was all. It was enough. I never went back to my family. Not once. There was no reason to. No conversation left. No explanation needed. What they had done had already been seen. And what I had become didn't need their acknowledgement. Sometimes I still think about my grandma, the way she used to look at me, like she saw something I didn't yet understand. Not with worry, with certainty. I understand that now. She wasn't trying to protect me from them. She was leaving me something to find. A way through. Not out. Through. I stood in the center of the living room one evening after most of the work was done. The house was quiet, open. Light moving through spaces that had once been closed. Nothing hidden. Nothing contained. I looked around slowly, at what it had been, at what it had become, and then I said it. Not loudly, not to anyone else, to myself. I decide who I am now. Not them, not what they built, not what they tried to erase. Me.